My name is Magella Doyle. I work at Washington University, and it is my really great pleasure to introduce Bruce Hall, who also works at Washington University. Bruce he's currently the Vice President and Chief Quality Officer for BJC Healthcare Corporation. He's a professor of surgery and of healthcare management for Washington University, and he's also an endocrine surgeon. Bruce obtained his BA from Princeton University, his PhD and his MD from Duke University, and his MBA from Harvard. So clearly he is extremely well qualified to be giving this oration. He initially was on faculty in Boston, but then came to join us in 2000 at Washington University and the business school, the Olin Business School. So his areas of expertise include performance measurement, quality improvement, insurance theory, and alternative payment models. He's authored over 150 peer-reviewed journals and book chapters in these areas. He has the frontline experience of leading quality improvement across a hospital system and has written and lectured extensively on the challenges of performance management and quality improvement. The topic of resource stewardship in healthcare, including pragmatic, operational, as well as policy issues. And these are particular passions of Dr. Hall. So we welcome you, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magella. Good morning, everyone. It's a particular honor for me to be introduced by Magella because 4 or 5 years ago, about 4 o'clock in the morning, one morning when I was convinced that either my gallbladder or my appendix needed to come out, and I wasn't sure which, in typical surgical fashion, Magella Doyle was who I called. So we all know in the room that the surgeon you call when you need help or your family needs help is the surgeon that carries your utmost respect. So thank you, Magella. It's also clearly a fantastic honor for me to be here this morning with all of you talking about the topic of stewardship, but talking in the context of the Betty and Henry Pitt Quality Oration. As you can see, this oration was established in honor of Henry and his commitment to quality, and I would say not just in HBB surgery, but across surgery overall. There has been an esteemed list of speakers in this oration, and I would not deem to put myself on this list. I'm extremely humbled to be invited to have this time with you this morning. I would like to thank Magella and Mike DeAngelica, Dr. Jarnigan, Dr. Kakudo, Will Chapman, Tara Kent, everyone on the program committee for this honor, but first and foremost, Betty and Henry for this honor. It's been an unexpected pleasure of my professional and personal career to get to know Henry Pitt and to work with Henry Pitt, even though we've never been at the same institution, and to count Henry not only as a colleague, but as a friend. I'd also like to extend my thanks to everyone else in this room because we've all been through an extraordinary couple of years, and I know everyone in this room has contributed to taking care of our respective communities during this time. So thank you for that service. I am a consulting director for the American College of Surgeons, and I am an advocate for the programs of the college. And this morning I will disguise a few numbers and present some numbers from slightly different time periods so that I'm not accused by my organization of revealing too much. But you have my word that I've not changed the underlying concept or intent of anything that I'll present to you. So we're going to talk about resource stewardship, and one thing I promise, you won't hear another talk here at this Congress that's quite this topic. And I will hope that you take this in the context and spirit that I deliver, and hope that we'll all be on the same page when we finish. At BJC Healthcare in WashU, we have 15 hospitals, more than 30,000 employees, and almost 5,000 physicians with privileges. We deliver 130,000 hospital admissions a year, and now almost 500,000 emergency room visits a year. Importantly, though, we deliver large amounts of financial assistance to our communities, including community health programs. We are the largest provider of charity care in the state of Missouri, and we are also a provider of almost $1 billion of financial assistance and educational assistance to our communities. We don't get the privilege of doing that without being stewards of resources. We all know from our own lives and practices that many activities rely on subsidization from other activities, cross-subsidization, if you will. And that need to cross-subsidize is one of the charges behind the drive for resource stewardship. And I'll hope to convince you of this even more strongly as we go. We have a good geographic footprint in Missouri and Illinois, and we are a mission-driven organization, as probably everyone in this room would say of their organizations. Our mission is very complicated when you try to capture it on paper, so I like to say the mission is that we want to take better care of more people. The national resource context, I understand and delight in the fact that this is an international gathering, but I will say that the U.S. is probably a poster child for less than optimal use of resources, and so I offer this as a bad example of a national context. We spend more per person and a larger percentage of our GDP per capita than any other country, and yet we have a substantial chunk of our populace that is not covered by our care insurance. So there's much we could improve. As physicians, we are responsible for a piece of expenditures that are our direct payment, but that's only about 1/5 of the country's expense. Yet as physicians, we control about 80% of the country's expense by virtue of our practice, our ordering behaviors, and our care of patients. So while our direct compensation is just a piece, our control of this profession cannot be ignored. If you look at the U.S. debt and encourage you to go right online, you can see this tick away every second. We've now passed $30 trillion of debt in the United States. No small piece of that is due to healthcare expenditure in the past. So as physicians and clinicians, this is our charge, and we cannot escape the responsibility of the obligation to be stewards. And out of respect to Dr. Pitt, just when we thought we knew what quality was supposed to be about, I'm going to stand here and tell you that there's more. We've got to expand our scope and be stewards as well. There's a very famous equation advanced by Mike Porter of Harvard that value is quality over cost. I think the best version of that is actually marginal value is marginal quality gains over marginal cost. We are where we are. We make a new expenditure to do a new activity, and we see what the new gains are. And that's how we all as humans think. We tend to think in terms of marginal change. But the key is that no service that we deliver as clinicians is ever delivered without some resource. And so the thing I don't like about this value equation is that it tends to portray quality and cost as two separate things, and they are not. Nothing we do is done without a resource. And so I'll hope to convince you over our time this morning that these are not separate issues. We conceptualize clinical excellence in very simple ways, sometimes boxes as simple as this for our organization, or in terms of a triple aim, or now more recently expanded into a quintuple aim. But I will argue that resource stewardship has to be emphasized as part of these portrayals, because we won't sustain care for our communities otherwise. So we know that clinical excellence is sort of a simple thing conceptually, but we also know it isn't. Clinical excellence is delivered in a very complex environment, a very complex enterprise called healthcare. And this morning we will talk about one piece. We will talk about some notion of efficiency. But don't walk out of the room thinking that's all that we care about or all that I care about. All right, a real life challenge. At BJC and WashU in St. Louis, we realized about 10 years ago that we were expending about 24% of our revenue on supplies. So what, you might ask? Well, when we benchmarked that across institutions nationwide, we really couldn't find any comparable organizations that were spending that much, that were using that much to deliver care. It was greater than any identifiable benchmark. And we realized that moving 1% of those expenditures from supply to labor, for instance, could generate 400 more frontline care jobs. And labor is more important now in the United States anyway than it ever has been, and I'm sure that's true internationally. So if we can preserve resources and devote them more to labor or anything else that's important to us, we should take that challenge on. And I will remind you that for us in context, our hospitals, we tend to target about a 3 or 4% margin. That's enough of a margin that we can reinvest in facilities over time and deliver care sustainably to our communities. But that margin level is quite different than some other partners in the healthcare industry, so keep that in mind. So 10 years ago, we were seeing our expenses grow at about 6% per year, greater than revenue growth, greater than reimbursement per unit, and we were expecting to pass $1 billion of supply and material expense very quickly. We wanted to move that 24% figure down to about 19% over the course of a few years, preserving 5% of revenue and enabling us to perhaps invest in about 2,000 more frontline jobs. That's between 5 and 10% of our entire workforce. And again, our true north is to sustain care for the community. So how do we start to think about that? Well, as an example, in 2017, 5 years ago, in our largest hospital, Barnes-Jewish Hospital, we had about 70 operating rooms active. And we delivered about 42,000 surgical cases in the year using 1.3 million different pieces of something. Implants, supplies, materials, 1.3 million. So when you walk into the OR next time, and you ask your supply chain colleagues, what have you done for me lately? They've delivered 1.3 million things to the OR so that we could all take care of our patients. So don't count them out. 17,000 different unique items. So it's a large challenge. This is 1 year of OR cases for us. This is the year of 2014 as an example. Every vertical line is 1 day in the OR, and the dots scattered across the top are the number of cases performed. So every vertical line is the supply expense for that day. You can see a median of about $450,000 of supply expense every day. And the scatter plot dots are the number of cases done that day. You can see the median there at about 156. To the far left, though, you'll see that 1 day in particular was a resource-intensive day. And I'd like to talk about that day. It happened to be tax day, April 15th on 2014. That day, we performed 163 cases, just above median. We delivered 400 hours of surgery to our patients, but we also used $800,000 of supply and materials in doing so. About 4,200 different items that day, about 25 different supply and material items per case on average. Now, a little bit of a teaser. Here's a picture 5 years later in 2019. And on July 4th of 2019, we delivered 222 surgeries. That's an increase of a third. We delivered 600 hours of care. That's an increase of 50%. But we did it using a lower level of expenditure. So that's a little teaser that over the 5 years, we were headed in the right direction. 1 day in the OR, April 15th, 2014, what we see is that 20% of our cases that day accounted for 80% of supply and material consumption. That's something called a Pareto principle, which everyone is familiar with, the old 80-20 rule. Pareto observed that 80% of the peas in his garden were produced by 20% of the pods. That's actually just one example of a power law distribution. Power law distributions are rife in our natural lives and across the natural sciences, nowhere more than in medicine and healthcare. So we see the Pareto principle in our case distributions for the year. If you focus on the lower right-hand corner, you'll see that about 6% of the surgical cases we deliver over the course of a year consume 50% of our expenditures. On the other hand, 56% of cases consume a very low level, total 6% of expenditures. So very clear, pronounced Pareto phenomenon, and nowhere will you see Pareto more clearly than in the insurance industry. This is the contribution to total health expenditures by individuals in the United States in 2016, about 5 years ago. To the far left, what you'll notice is that 1% of our populace consumes 20% of all expenditures over the course of a year. Think about that. 1 person out of 100 requires 1/5 of our resources and attention. That's a phenomenon we need to keep in mind because we'll need to focus on where the resources go so that we make sure we're doing it efficiently. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying it's a good focus. On the other hand, to the far right of this slide, you'll see a very small blue bar. That's the lower 50% of the populace, and they consume about 3% of all of our expenditures. Most of them are healthy. Many of them will never encounter health care during the year. But half of our populace consumes just 3% of our expenditures. So again, Pareto. Why do we care about Pareto again? Pareto because Pareto helps us find, to use another term, the low-hanging fruit. We care about low-hanging fruit because we want to start there, we want to learn there, we want to demonstrate big impact, we want to make friends, develop champions, practice, 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 and get good at resource stewardship. And then from there, we'll move into ever more challenging pieces of this puzzle. If you think about the principles of high reliability, Pareto actually goes somewhat against the principles of high reliability, but Pareto is where you learn. The principle of high reliability is paying attention to the data, respect for the data. You can't only look at 20% of your cases and hold that. You also have to be sensitive to operations. You can't look at just 20% of your cases and hold that. But you can look at 20% of your cases and learn and develop your skills, and that's what we do. So on April 15th, we looked at all of the cases done. Again, we see that just 5% of our surgical sections accounted for 80% of the expenditures. 20% of the sections. And those 5 sections were cardiac surgery, orthopedic spine, neurospine, orthopedic joint, and neurocranie. No surprise, those are surgeries that often involve implants and materials that we leave behind on purpose, and that's an important consideration. When we dive below the section level down to individual cases and look at the individual cases, in this case the x-axis is case duration and the y-axis is expenditure, and we see that the most expensive, most resource-intense cases of the day were multi-level orthopedic spine fusion, 2 cardiac VAD implantations, and another spine infusion. The longest case of the day was actually fairly low cost. It was a partial mandibulectomy with a free flap. So in general, when you are in the OR longer, you are doing a procedure that will use more resources. Which is the cause and which is the effect is an important question. But in general, the longer you're in the OR, the more resources you will need. And with rare exception, very long cases are going to be expensive cases, costly cases. We also look at payer and margins because we want to know where to lobby our local, state, and national governments. And in this picture, which I can see the colors unfortunately don't project very strongly, but what you'll see is that for the most resource-intense cases to the left or for the least resource-intense cases to the right, margins are determined by payer and not determined by the decisions of the surgeon. And so we know that while we are working on resource stewardship, we have to also work at the policy level, both state and federal, in order to make sure that we preserve resources to serve our communities. So the next 2 slides are controversial slides when it comes to talking to surgeons. This first slide shows you all of the surgeons at our organization who over the course of an entire year generated a net positive margin contribution for the organization. That's by virtue of what they did in the OR and by virtue of the stays of those patients in the hospital. So for these surgeons, 20% of them generated 80% of the net margin for the organization. That's a Pareto that we're not surprised by. But what's surprising is that these surgeons with positive contributions were actually only 40% of all surgeons. When we add the rest of this graph, and now the entire graph is reproduced to the right, what we see is that about 60% of surgeons over the course of the year do not generate positive contributions to the organization. All of their cases summed for the entire year result in either neutral or negative impact on the organization. We don't generate that fact to penalize anyone or to criticize anyone. We generate that fact to reemphasize that our profession relies on cross-subsidization. We all do things that we need to cross-subsidize against other activities. And so we shouldn't march into any negotiation thinking that we are the most important piece of the puzzle for our hospital or our community. We are a very important piece, but we depend on many, many interdependencies that we can't ignore. All right, how do we get surgeons' heads right down into the ground level here? Cost per case. So if you'll focus on the bubble chart here, this is laparoscopic cholecystectomy across what you see there in the bubble chart is 7 of our hospitals in our system where we do laparoscopic cholecystectomies. One bubble is one hospital. The larger bubbles are higher volume. The different colors are different hospitals. The x-axis is median case cost, in this case $513 of supply to get a laparoscopic cholecystectomy done. The y-axis is standard deviation. So you might think that the highest volume hospitals would have the lowest standard deviation and be very consistent and reproducible. That relationship is not so clear. not so clear. When we go from the hospital level down to the surgeon level, here's where we are. Each bubble is now a surgeon. The color is the hospital at which that surgeon does the plurality of their services. The x-axis remains the case cost intensity, and the median remains $513. The y-axis is that standard deviation. So while, again, you might think that the highest volume surgeons would have the lowest standard deviation and be most reproducible and most consistent, we don't always see that. When we present data at surgeon level like this, everyone in the room knows what the exchanges look like. The first is, you don't understand, my patients are sicker. The second is, you don't understand, my patients do better. And the third is, you don't understand, I spend a little more, but I'm faster, so I get 5 cases done instead of 4. We have to address each of those concerns, right? We don't make friends with our surgical colleagues by blowing those concerns away. The first thing we do is cross-match everybody's financials against the complication rates that we see. In this case, we draw these complication rates out of an ISQIP program. And what you see is no clear relationship between what you spend and your avoidance of complication. With laparoscopic cholecystectomy, where complications are fairly rare, it's almost a sporadic pattern, right? No real relationship to spend in the OR. We can use NISQIP data to also say, by the way, also your patients are or are not more complex than anyone else's. I don't have that on this slide, but we use NISQIP to answer both of those questions. And then when it comes to case duration, I'll make a comment on that in just a minute. So then we say, where was the expense? Where did it occur? What are the categories of expense? We show the surgeons where the dollars are going. We show them some decisions that might be made differently by different surgeons, what the impact on resources might be, and ask surgeons whether that variation that we're seeing is necessary, justifiable, either by the patient or some other reason, or whether there's variation there that's unwarranted that we might be able to squeeze out. Here's another example. The first was trocars, this is clippers. Just letting folks know more transparently where the resources are headed. And then we go back, we pick a surgeon who looks like a good volume, very, very low cost, very good standard deviation, so they're very consistent. And we just start talking about all the decisions that surgeon made over the course of a year to accomplish what they've just accomplished. And by the way, that surgeon that I'm pointing to is the fastest surgeon across our 15 hospitals, right? Not the surgeon spending the most, not even the surgeon with the highest volume, but a very consistent, controlled cost and the fastest surgeon in our system, and also low complication rate. So here's another example with a comment on duration. This is prostatectomy, different topic, but what you don't see in this scatter plot is that high spend equals fast. What you see, in fact, is that high spend is long duration. Again, when you're in the OR a long time, you're doing a case that's going to consume more resources, and it's not just OR time. So that notion that I'm faster, I spend a little bit more, but I'm faster, is one that generally does not hold up. The duration in the OR is really a different topic driven by different issues. And then wash, rinse, and repeat. That was lap chole, here comes colectomy. Same picture with the surgeons, cross them against their complication rates, tell them where the money's going, tell them about decisions that they might make differently, ask them why they're choosing the expensive construct instead of the least expensive construct, and if there's a good reason, then we understand. And if there's not a good reason, then we continue to push. And then pick a surgeon who looks like a great example and talk about what exactly decisions they made. One way we've started doing just in the last year or two about that last point, showing more transparency about decisions, is now when our surgeons exit cases, they get a case cost receipt in their Epic in basket. So I've reproduced a large document here, a receipt that any one of us might get after a case. I know it's too small to read. This is a receipt after a paraesophageal hernia. It shows that this surgeon spent about $2,300 on resources during that case. Their average is about $1,600 for this case. Their peer average for this case is also about $1,600. And now they can see exactly what happened during that case. And they may not say, this is enough information for me to do anything differently, but then we take that conversation into section meetings like this, into section meetings like this, where we can show each surgeon what are the top 5 cases you did, and how did those expenditures compare against your 5 colleagues who are also doing those cases. So transparency and conversation discussion. And then we have the same conversation at the hospital level. We go to the hospital and say, you know what, doing a prostatectomy at this hospital seems to cost more than every other one of our hospitals. Can we explain that? If we can explain it, okay. If we can't explain it, we can't tolerate it. You won't succeed at this challenge without controlling new technology entry into your organization. So we have a formal, explicit new product review board process. I won't go into very much detail, but suffice to say that we have more than 250,000 products on our formulary for our system today. And every year we get a request for about up to 500 more to be added. So we have a board of 7 vice presidents that reviews those requests. You can see the criteria that we review those requests on. Clinical, efficacy, safety are always at the top of the list, but resource impact is important as well. And when we do bring a new product or material into the system, we ask whether something else can be eliminated. We've got to be stewards with this equation. All right, let's get to the bottom line. I've said a decade's journey. This is a table of only 9 years. I haven't added 2021 to the table yet. But what you'll see at the very bottom of the table is that over the last 9 years, we've preserved $470+ million for our hospital system. That's $50 to $60 million per year that we didn't have to spend. $50 to $60 million per year. So raise your hand if your hospital would like $50 to $60 million per year preserved, right? Consistently over 10 years. First of all, let me return briefly to the comment on margins. This is $50 million a year that goes right to your bottom line, right? It's expense that you didn't spend. If you're going to generate top line with a 5% margin yielding $50 million, you're talking about $1 billion of top line revenue. So I like to tell surgical colleagues when we have these conversations that we're trying to save $1 million, $1.78 at a time, and we are, but it matters. It adds up. The other thing to note from this slide, though, is if you look down the column called projects, projects means investigations, conversations, portrayals, like I've just shown you, large contracts, small contracts, you name it, projects of different sizes. But these wins didn't come without a lot of effort. Look at that column and you'll see now 600 projects a year being done, right? 600 exchanges, interactions to accomplish these things. So this is hard work. It's hard work and I'm really proud. We show up every day trying to close out 2 projects and save $200,000 for our hospital system. That's our goal every single day we show up. So we did move our expense down from about 24% net revenue down to the 19s range. And as I said, we've preserved nearly $500 million now over 9 years. We've watched quality, right? This is about the relationship to the care we deliver to the community. We've watched quality over this time. Our quality has not deteriorated and in fact has improved. Although just like everyone else in the country and across the world, we're seeing some quality measures plateau nowadays. But this graph shows our preventable harm performance continuously improving over time with some plateau in the most recent couple years. Where do we go next? I think there's a broader question of stewardship that we're just getting around to, and that is environmental stewardship. I think environmental stewardship needs to be portrayed under our triple or quintuple aim. We see more and more information being passed around now about greenhouse gas emissions being caused by us, by our industry of healthcare, and that those emissions in and of themselves are causing loss of life and disability. We have to pay more attention to the environment that we're working in worldwide. And fortunately, we're seeing more people working on greening a lot of our processes. The second link here on this slide is a link to the American Society of Anesthesiologists' recent white paper on greening our perioperative area. And if you haven't seen that, it's a fantastic document with a lot of wonderful suggestions. So I refer you to that. It's a great resource. You'll see more environmental impact statements, you'll see more emissions footprints, you'll see more energy audits, not only for us and our hospitals, but for all of our industry partners. So there's much more to come. Quality and cost are not separate. They're linked. That's how we deliver the care we deliver. And it is our moral obligation to pay attention as we deliver care to our communities and our populations. So I'd like to think that our best vision of healthcare quality nowadays is a sustained provision of the necessary health care that our communities need, emphasizing resource and environmental stewardship. This issue of cross-subsidization cannot be ignored. Let me close with a very brief anecdote. Recently, we were able to open 5 different school-based health clinics in an area of the St. Louis region that is underprivileged. School-based health clinics. Make no mistake, we can only do that because we're cross-subsidizing from other activities, right? Those clinics, unfortunately, don't pay for themselves. But the number one piece of feedback we heard from families using those clinics was, can you put a door on the side of the school so we don't have to go through the school? Because it's where the family wanted and needed to come. It was the only health care they could access in practical terms. And that means that we're serving that community in a way that they need that we haven't been. And many of those activities require cross-subsidization and more attention to resource stewardship from all of us. Once again, thank you for the honor of this time with you this morning. It's a true privilege to be here in the name of Betty and Henry.